Now we want to turn to a slightly different direction. We want to get more of a global picture, and to that extent, we're going to be joined by NYU professor Mark Galeotti. Mark, are you there? I think I see a picture. Mark is probably one of the most prominent researchers and experts on modern Russia and on crime and organized crime. So, researching Spetsnaz, the Russian special service. So, Mark, we have a general question for you, if you can hear us. What is Putin's strategy at this point? Is it clear?
Well, his broad intentions, I think, are clear. Putin is, let's be honest, not a strategist. He's a tactician.
What's the difference between those two?
Well, in a way, strategy is the big long-term plan. Tactics is what do you do tomorrow and what do you do the week after. You know what Putin wants? Putin wants essentially a Ukraine that is willing to accept that it is part of Russia's sphere of influence. And he went into the Donbas precisely because he thought this would be a short, quick way of essentially putting pressure on Kyiv to acknowledge that it had no right to think of itself as an independent state. It had no right to think of itself as a European state. This, of course, hasn't worked. So I think what we see at the moment is, in a way, not that Putin has some big long-term notion of exactly how he's going to either get out of the mess that is the current Donbas adventure, or be able to actually get Kyiv to capitulate. Instead, he's setting up a series of potential opportunities. They are, for example, moving forces into the Donbas region so that they can reinstigate military operations if they choose to, and on a variety of different potential directions. At the same time, there is a political structure in place that theoretically gives them a certain degree of coverage. So I think what Putin is doing is essentially creating opportunities for either, if he decides he needs to do something, or just as likely, if Kiev makes a mistake, he will be in a position to act.
Mark, with Minsk stalled, is escalation required again to move forwards, as you're writing a lot about that before every big agreement or something, there is an escalation in order that the Russia speaks from, or the separatists speak from the position of the strength?
Well, it's possible, but I'd be cautious though, because we see a situation which is rather different. First of all, the Ukrainian forces are beginning to actually stand up in more effective capacities. They're still a long way from being able to actually fight the Russians on an equal footing, but nonetheless they are less divided, less uncertain than they were in the past. Secondly, at present, Russia, frankly, I think, has worked out that it can deal with the current level of the sanctions regime from the West. Any major escalation, I stress that major, something more like trying to take Mariupol, could actually lead to a major escalation in Western sanctions once again, and reverse a lot of Moscow's efforts to try and break the unity, particularly of the European Union. So, I mean, I think the Russians are going to be much more cautious. But on the other hand, we're seeing, for example, we've seen potential moves towards Adiivka, whether it's just simply to deny the Ukrainian economy the opportunity to use the coking works there, or as a prelude to some kind of offensive. And likewise, we're seeing a build-up of forces in Luhansk, with the possibility of moving northwards. So I think at the moment, in a way, what the Russians are doing is testing the waters.
Now, on that note, when you talk about signaling, you talk about this preparation and strategy. A big focus of that has been the Russian special forces. And you have a book coming out next month on the Spetsnaz, on these special forces. I mean, it seems like in terms of their image and confidence in them, they're, invincible on cloud nine at this point. They are able to take back Crimea. They've been able to organize all these things. The SBU in Ukraine is still considered to be heavily infiltrated by people from the Russian special services. Is that image correct? What are they able to do and what aren't they?
Yes, I think you actually have to be aware of this risk of thinking of them all as 10-foot tall super ninjas. They're definitely not. They are highly competent intervention forces. First of all, we have to distinguish between the special service in the sense of the Federal Security Service and so forth, the spies, and the Spetsnaz, who are commandos. And as such, they're pretty good commandos. It's interesting that the two were captured quite recently, showing that they're not sort of immortals or superheroes. Some of them are conscripts. What they can do is, in a way, to be the very tip of the spear. When the Russians want to actually move in, The spetsnaz can be there first, and yes, they're highly professional and so forth. But what they can't do is fight in a serious battle. So anyway, they're the ones who, as it were, take place first, and then the Russians have to support other troops. So they're effective, but they can only be effective when they're added to other forces. Or another thing that they can do very well, which is unfortunately cause mischief. Along with the intelligence services, they can be used for behind-the-lines sort of terrorist-type attacks and so forth. And it could well be that they are involved in the continuing spate of mysterious, semi-mysterious things that we've seen through Ukraine or whatever. But again, that's not going to change the war. That simply is one small aspect of it.
Now, and when we look specifically at the separatist-controlled areas of Ukraine, I mean, obviously there's a lot of these special forces involvement, but where does that link up with crime? Because there's a lot of overlap that many people in the West don't understand, the kind of leadership with organized crime. And in the separatist-controlled areas, that seems to play a role in financing these regimes. What are those connections like?
Yes, it's been one of the most striking and depressing novelties of this campaign, the extent to which we've seen the Russians really capitalise on something that they've done on a small scale before, which is precisely to turn to organised crime as a kind of mercenary force, an ally. In the Crimea, more or less, the Crimean government is essentially sort of linked to organised crime and corrupt officials, and the first sort of quote-unquote local auxiliaries, self-defense militias that turned up, were basically gangsters in uniform. And likewise, now we see in the separatist areas, some of the various militia units are clearly just organised crime groups that have just simply sort of gone legal or gone official. But also we're seeing increasing flows of smuggling, either out through the Crimean ports, or else across the border. Unfortunately, sort of Russian and Ukrainian organised crime is still cooperating. And this is an issue because it's one that clearly the main connection is the GRU, Russian Military Intelligence, which also runs the spetsnaz. So what we see in Ukraine is, in a way, a new and frankly unique fusion of military capabilities, espionage and intelligence capabilities, and organised crime. And that's something that, in a way, we're not really yet sure how we can deal with that most effectively.
You've written that the organized crime could have been involved in organizing different things in Odessa. We don't mean in this fire, which had been a year ago, but in general, Odessa is famous for that. Do you think it's also there? What is the role of the people from that region in the whole conflict?
Well, I think the issue here we have to realise that organised crime is not political. Organised crime is entirely mercenary. It's just out for money. Now, in many parts of Ukraine, frankly, Ukrainian gangsters are still cutting deals with the Russian gangsters, particularly the ones that are involved in drug trafficking into Western Europe. Odessa is in a slightly different position, actually. In Odessa, you're increasingly seeing the local gangsters who made a lot of money through smuggling through Odessa, actually beginning to face competition from Sevastopol. And so in that respect, actually beginning to see the Crimeans as enemies rather than potential partners. So actually, I guess there is one example of a place in which actually organised crime might well not be a potential asset for the Russians. But pretty much everywhere else, so far at least, Ukrainian gangsters have been cutting deals with Russian gangsters. Doesn't necessarily mean they're working for Moscow or anything like that, but they're certainly not, as it were, motivated by patriotism, just by money.
Mark, so many people speak all the time about the Putin strategy, Russian strategy. Do you see that there is any strategy of the Ukrainian government? What is the Ukraine strategy?
That's actually a lot harder to answer. In a way, at least we know that Putin, whatever Putin wants, Putin gets, at least in terms of Russian policy. In Ukraine, I mean, like any democracy, but particularly as a new and fragile one, it's not just a question of what Poroshenko or whoever might want, but what can they actually push on the ground. I think the trouble with Kyiv is I don't actually see a viable long-term strategy, except more or less slowly building up resistance, shall we say, to Russian pressure. And in a way, hoping that either Russia will be forced to back away from its current venture in the Donbas, or that somehow the West will come in and help things out, which is not going to happen, barring some great change. So I think this is what we see a sort of a desire to reform Ukraine, rather than a blueprint for how we will get the Donbas back.
And Mark, the last from me. You mentioned espionage and different kind of counterintelligence. What is its role in this conflict, also from the Russian side and not just?
Yeah, I mean, I think, let's be honest, it is basically from the Russian side. Ukraine does not at the moment have any kind of meaningful intelligence capability to turn against the Russians.
But I mean also the counterintelligence in the Western countries.
Yes, I mean, look, at the moment, Russia basically still has free rein across Ukraine. The SBU was so hopelessly penetrated, and although moves have been made to actually cleanse the SBU, honestly, I'm not as convinced as the SBU's own leadership that it really has been sort of cleared of most Russian agents. But beyond that, also, Russia has massive electronic intercept capabilities. I mean, basically, they know whatever's happening in Ukraine. And obviously they are also active in Western Europe, but they're fighting a very different kind of campaign. Again, it's much more professional, much more experienced counterintelligence services that haven't basically been trained by the Russians for the last decade or two. And at present, what we're seeing is the West trying to provide assistance to the SBU, but it's very. And again, I think this is a very long-term issue. But at the moment, in a way, Ukraine has to accept, essentially, that Russia is going to know what it's doing. There's no point in thinking that it can actually really keep secrets. And those secrets are between two people in a closed room or a parked car far from anywhere else. So that's not going to be a way that Kyiv, unfortunately, can maneuver against Moscow.
So, Mark, thanks a lot for your terrific output. We really have learned a lot.